All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started as some of our members start joining us. Welcome, Dr. Buscho. We're very excited to have you present to our network. This is Dr. Ann Gold Buscho, PhD. She is a licensed clinical psychologist who specializes in family issues and issues related to divorce, parenting, parenting planning, and co-parenting counseling. She has professional and personal experience with the topic of nesting, co-parenting, step-parenting, and single parenting issues. She has presented widely at state and national conferences to attorneys, to mental health professionals, to financial professionals, and to professionals who work on collaborative divorce. She's spoken about the practice of collaborative divorce, forgiveness practices, nesting during divorce, and consensual dispute resolution. And she is a wonderful person to present to the Divorceify network, which, as we all know, has all these types of practitioners in our network throughout the country. And today, we have also invited some clients to come and join us, and we'll be sharing the recording with some divorce clients who have used our platform to find help and resources. I personally feel very connected to this topic as an attorney who works with primarily young couples who are looking to resolve their divorce amicably. My own private practice before launching Divorceify was called Family-Centered Divorce and Mediation, and I often told parents that I thought some of the most successful divorces were the ones that were child-centered. So very excited to have you, and I would love it if we could start with you just introducing yourself to our network and our clients, and also talking a little bit about what you do broadly, and introducing us to the wonderful new book that you have written, A Child-Centered Solution to, The Parent's Guide to Birdnesting, A Child-Centered Solution to Co-Parenting During Separation and Divorce. Welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yes, everything is about child-centered, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a psychologist. I live in Northern California. We can barely breathe in the fire and smoke that we've been dealing with. But as you said, I just had my new book released called A Parent's Guide to Birdnesting. Because I work with so many divorcing families, it's become clear to me over the years that the key to divorce is keeping the children stable and helping families recover from divorce. I'm particularly interested in nesting because 27 years ago, my ex-husband and I nested for 15 months, and we had no idea at that time what we were doing. We didn't have a guidebook. There was no guidebook. There still is no guidebook until my book was published. And the thing about nesting means that the children stay in the home and the parents rotate in and out, on and off duty, according to a very clear, written, documented schedule, and with some very clear agreements that will make the nesting work. Nesting is really great for parents who are both committed to being involved parents, mm-hmm. and who are also committed to putting their own emotions, putting their children's needs ahead of their own emotions, prioritizing their children's needs. So those are the two main ingredients really for successful nesting, is if parents can be respectful with each other, prioritize their kids, document agreements, have a clear schedule, then they can nest successfully. So people always ask, where does the off-duty parent go? Yeah. So the off-duty parent, there's so many different ways to set up living arrangements depending on many things, including your budget, including where you live, the size of your home, what the rental market is like. If you have family or friends you can stay with. The interesting thing is during COVID, which of course happened after my book was at the publisher. During COVID, many families have been forced to nest because of the pandemic, and people who had maybe their marriages were stressed or in trouble before the pandemic, now they know that they need to get divorced, and they're still living in the same home. So that's
if I could just interject for a second. So just to back up, one thing I think is a common misconception about bird nesting when I've told, my own clients about it is like, how can we live like that forever? And it's not intended to be the permanent custodial plan, right? The
Right.
permanent parenting plan. So in divorce, we think of there's several stages. There's the should we get divorced stage, right? Where you might be thinking about it privately before you talk to your partner about it. And that's like a lot of research and maybe talking to friends if you're brave enough to do that, or maybe it's just a lot of online research, or and then you finally talk to your partner about it. And then there's the should we conversation that happens between the two of you. Sometimes it's an obvious answer. You both agree it's time to move on, but sometimes it's not obvious. And in either scenario, there's then the how do we get divorced process and then the negotiating of the divorce. So bird nesting is really intended to happen when?
It's really intended to happen, first of all, when parents need a break from the conflict. It might be that they just need some respite to step back and decide about what they want, what the future of their relationship is going to be.
Right.
It's usually temporary. Sometimes people will reconcile. More often they do move on to divorce. About 13% do reconcile.
Interesting.
But it's intended to be a transitional or temporary arrangement that usually lasts until some milestone is reached, like the end of the school year or the divorce is finished.
Right.
But in the book, I interviewed a family that nested for 6.5 years. And
Yeah.
I've since then met families that have nested for even longer. So it's usually temporary, but some families really like it and they continue until the kids are all grown. That's
Right.
not the norm, but that's certainly possible.
So in the goal of bird nesting is really to create stability for the children, but it also has the added benefit of giving the parents like time and space away from the tense nature of living together to
Right.
really think a little bit more rationally about what they want for themselves, for their family, for their relationship. And then while negotiating the divorce, they're not right on top of each other in the same house.
Right. The children keep their same routines. They sleep in the
Yeah.
same bed every night. Their lives go on pretty much as usual. But the nesting gives the children a chance to adapt to having one parent at a time,
Right.
which is what will happen later. And also the parents learn about how to be a single parent. That's not so easy. And when you're nesting, they get to build up their skills, especially since there's a division of labor in marriage that has to change when people separate. So they get to practice that. I think the most important benefit to nesting for parents is that break, that emotional break where they can step back and maybe get some counseling, maybe not, but to make those big decisions and take care of their own emotions while they're before they start a legal process, hopefully.
Right. It totally makes sense. So another common reaction I got when I talked to clients about this, and just for the background of the audience, I already told Dr. Buscho this, is I was a litigator and then a mediator in Philadelphia and then Manhattan. So in an urban environment, the apartment is small often, and it can be very close quarters for people who are getting divorced, but then both getting new apartments right away can feel totally unfeasible financially. And also you don't really know what your long-term budget is. So it's hard to make that choice. And to uproot the kids right away can be a lot, and school districts. So there's just a lot going into the new living arrangements. And so when I would pitch bird nesting, one of the common reactions I would get is just like, that sounds really expensive. So what are some of the different ways you can navigate living, making this work,
Yeah. So it is a question that always comes up. And one advantage to nesting is that if you can wait until you know what your financial situation is, nesting can help.
Right.
It's true that going out and renting 2 new places is costly. And if you don't know what your budget is, that's not going to work. In my work, I've worked with many families who've nested in a variety of arrangements. I've had one man that slept at his office. He had a fold-out sofa, but he ate a lot of fast food and he wasn't happy with that.
Right.
And so, nesting was okay as a temporary arrangement for him. I had another client, a woman who rented Airbnbs for her off-duty time. I have many clients that stay with friends or family members. And then there are people who've been able to carve out space in their own homes. So in a small apartment, it's probably not going to work very well. But if you have a house with, let's say, an extra bedroom, or you can move kids around to create an extra bedroom, it is possible to nest in the same home with the parents being in separate bedrooms. That raises a whole lot of further complications that usually need to be talked about, but that's probably the most economical way to nest. When my ex and I nested, I rented a room in a big house with about 5 other people, and my ex actually started staying with his new girlfriend, and our nesting ended when he decided he wanted her to move into our home.
Right.
So that was the quote milestone that ended our nesting. So there are a lot of different ways to set up your living arrangements.
That makes a lot of sense. So another hesitancy that people would have that I think leads into our next topic is, what about snooping? Like in divorce, there's a lot of suspicion of the other person. Even in amicable relationships, there can be a desire to snoop on your spouse in a way you've never snooped on them before. So I would say, a common concern I would get is if we're going to rent a second apartment and both share that apartment and go in and out of the house in the apartment, where is the private space? How do we deal with those issues of suspicion? So what would you say to someone who raised that as a concern?
Well, I think the issue of privacy is a concern no matter what your living arrangements are, because at the main home, you have to have agreements about where each person's space is. You have to have agreements not to move anything, not to get into each other's computers. I always recommend staying off social media, because if you see your spouse on social media having a wonderful time, it can be really triggering.
Yeah.
But having clear agreements about what is private is really important. And I've seen some parents actually put locks on their bedroom doors because there just wasn't quite enough trust to keep that agreement, or to feel secure with that agreement.
Right. So maybe trust and like a lack of trust, you can navigate around that in certain ways, like the lock on the door, or creating some ground rules. Are there any other red flags? In your book, you actually have a questionnaire that people can fill out, which I thought was a wonderful, wonderful worksheet, where you can really write down, is this like a true false about our relationship questionnaire? And it's a series of questions, and some of them you don't know ahead of time. Afterwards, if you answer true or false to them, are actually red flags to the person reviewing it. And so you say, okay, did you answer true to any of the following things? These are red flags. So what are some of the red flags that might come up for a couple that would make them think, maybe this isn't right for us?
Right. Well, when we talk about trust, lack of trust is certainly a red flag, but trust can be rebuilt by keeping agreements. That's why the agreement part of nesting is so important. The real red flags are unstable, untreated mental illness, unstable addiction, that if there's been any domestic violence, if there's been child abuse, if people can't manage their own emotions well enough to put their kids' needs ahead. Total lack of respect for the other parent is a red flag. In nesting, we hope that parents can at least agree that they both love their children and they both want what's best for them. And if there's at least some respect for the other parent, very often we'll have a parent say, well, dad is the fun dad. But if I talk a little more, it's like, yeah, no, he really loves them and he's really a pretty good parent.
Right.
So both parents have to want to be involved, and there has to be some basic respect for each parent.
I think that it's pretty common for there to be one parent that always does X, whether it's make the lunches or make the dinners or take them to the doctor or do pickup at school. And sometimes that's very, in today's modern couples, that can be very evenly divided in terms of how many things you have on both sides, and sometimes it's not. But both parent tends to have a hesitancy to give up a portion of the things they have been doing. Like, you've never made lunch for them before. How are you going to make lunch for them? Or, well, you can't cook dinner. What are they going to eat the nights that you're making dinner? Whatever it is, you know? So what do you say? Do you think bird nesting makes it easier to transition into a shared parenting schedule? Does it lessen some of that nervousness that people feel when they're for the first time ceding some of that ground to the other parent?
I think that it does. First of all, they don't have the stress of transporting kids back and forth and dealing with those kinds of difficult transitions. I often, there is a division of labor in marriage, such as what you mentioned, mom makes the kids lunches, dad takes the kids roller skating, whatever it is, that parents can coach each other. That's part of the good enough communication. If parents are willing to help each other come up to speed in the areas where they hadn't really done that before, that's important. There's a big learning curve for parents when they're taking up picking up the new chores or the new skills that they haven't had in the past.
Right. So I think that the good enough communication, that's something you just mentioned. I really want to talk about that. So there is an amicable divorce movement sweeping our country. And I'm a practitioner who really likes to help people have the most amicable divorce possible. But in experience, I can just say that, even if you want to have a friendly divorce, it can be very hard to maintain that throughout the whole divorce. And some couples, they look at what's out there with celebrities having these nice divorces and going on vacation together. And they just think, I am way too pissed off at my spouse for that to ever be me. And I don't think we're amicable enough to do a nesting thing. And so what I loved in your book was the idea of good enough communication. It doesn't have to be perfect, but what does it mean for it to be good enough?
Well, I think it has to be, first of all, respectful. Second of all, an agreement to share information about the children, not to use the children as intermediaries or messengers or spies, and to keep them out of the middle. Good enough communication means you're not going to start sharing your feelings, your emotions. You're not going to talk about why the marriage failed. That's not necessary for good enough communication.
Right.
The good enough communication means talking honestly about the agreements that you're making, not making agreements that you can't keep. Sometimes people will make agreements and there's no way they can keep them. So making agreements that good enough means making agreements that they can actually commit to, and being honest about that. There's also communication about the children that has to go back and forth as parents come in and off, on and off duty. So they need to be able to bring the other parent up to speed.
And when you're thinking about your children and, is this the right arrangement for my children? What are some of the considerations what are some of the things you might think through?
For the children?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you have to think about the age of the children, and how they are normally. Are they pretty resilient? Are they pretty strong? Or do any of them have special needs? The idea about nesting as a transitional arrangement is that the goal is to keep kids stable and to keep conflict away from them. What we know is that conflict is the one thing that hurts children more than anything in divorce. So creating a nesting agreement that protects the kids from conflict, that's critical.
Yeah.
Younger kids, it's harder for them to go back and forth between two homes, and they need more frequent contact with their parents. So I would try to create a schedule that works for their needs. Every schedule is going to be different. Every family's nesting arrangement is going to be different because there's no cookie cutter. It needs to be tailored to the needs of the family.
Right. Is there any special consideration that happens with like very, very young children? Like I have had a few cases that involved like newborns. Obviously both parents want to bond with the newborn, but that can have some practical hurdles when it comes to breastfeeding and availability of the caretaker, et cetera. So what is your like advice to parents trying to navigate a newborn being in the mix, or a child under 1, let's say?
Yeah. I've worked with families like this, and clearly the needs of the children, again, have to be prioritized.
Yeah.
So if the child is breastfeeding, the schedule needs to allow that to continue in a way that both parents can tolerate.
Mm-hmm.
If they can't tolerate it, then it's not going to work.
Right.
So that's where making agreements you can actually commit to is so important.
Right.
You know, we talk about maximizing the child's time with each parent.
Right.
And that means doing what's realistic. If a parent is working and traveling a lot and not around a lot, the maximum amount of time the child can be with that parent may not be as much as the maximum time the child can be with the other parent.
Right.
So I don't think in terms of percentages, I really discourage people from talking about, oh, I want 50-50. I really discourage that. I talk about how can we maximize your child's time with each of you.
Right. That makes sense. Because we don't all have the same amount of availability. That's just
right.
life, right?
It has to be realistic. It has to work.
Right. And when people think about ending nesting, like you had mentioned, there's a couple logical endpoints. What are some of the more common ones?
I think the most common one is probably when the divorce is done.
Mm-hmm.
Very often, if parents own their home, it's not unusual for parents to have to sell the home.
Sure.
So that might be when nesting has to end, is when the home goes on the market. Mm-hmm. Another really common time to end nesting is at the end of a school year. Those are the most common, I would say.
Got it.
But another common one is when one of the parents gets into a new relationship, right, and that relationship becomes a committed relationship. And that's what happened with my ex-husband when he wanted to move his girlfriend in. So that's also a time when parents need to sit down and talk about how we're going to wind up the nesting, and to give each other plenty of notice, advance notice, so that they can do it in a smooth way, a nice transition for the kids.
You know, and this is we could have an entirely different Zoom call about introducing your children to your new partner, or your co-parent to your new partner, and when to do that or not do that. But I just want to mention for our audience that you did have a lot of helpful suggestions about that in your book, and some of the, ways to really think through it logically, because it is an emotional thing for all of us to think about our partner with somebody else, or ourselves with somebody else, and introducing our children to that person. And whenever something's very emotional, it can be hard to be logical about it. And I thought you had some really helpful guidance on that. So I just want to refer people that's another helpful thing that you can learn about in the doctor's book. And one thing I want to touch about before we wrap up our half hour together is, some people really are interested in exploring reconciliation. And I know that you can explore that during the period of nesting. So what does that look like? If divorce has been already put on the table, and maybe one of you is very hesitant and wants to make sure that you've done everything you can to save the marriage, or maybe you're just both not sure. What does it look like to explore reconciliation while you're nesting?
So there are a couple ways, and I want to answer that, but I want to go back to the previous point about new relationships.
Sure.
Because one thing I want to point out in nesting is it's important to have an agreement about not bringing dates into the home. Yes. And have that explicitly stated, because one way nesting can really fail is when one parent brings a date or a new relationship into the home where the children are. In terms of exploring reconciliation, some people will agree to weekly therapy during the time that they're nesting. They might even agree to a weekly date night if they're serious about reconciling. There is a form of therapy called discernment therapy, which is a kind of therapy that helps people come to a decision about the future of their relationship. And the therapist works with the couple. Mm-hmm. And if they decide to reconcile, the therapist will help them develop steps to that. And if they decide to divorce, the therapist will help them develop steps to kind of a smooth transition to the divorce process.
And I do want to mention that discernment counseling is one of the practices we have in our network. If people are looking for people who specialize in that, it can be hard to find, but we do have people who do virtual sessions in discernment counseling and are very talented. And honestly, I think that it can be difficult to convince a partner who knows they want a divorce to participate in this sort of process of exploring if that's the right move, or, both getting on the same page. And I have to say, I've had clients on both sides of that issue. The person who really was sure they wanted it and they were dragging their partner along, or the person who was being dragged along. And I have to say that taking the time out to really get to where you're both on the same page is going to make your divorce so much smoother, because it just makes the whole process feel more respectful, and it starts it on the right foot, and it also makes it so that you're both, this is what you need to do, and it makes it much easier to move through the decision making process of every divorce decision, of which there are a million. And so I would really encourage people to take the time, even if you're the one who is sure you want the divorce, to have the respect for your partner, to go through the goal-oriented process of discernment counseling, and even to just say, okay, I'm going to give it a few months to help this person get on the same page. That's really important. And I think that when you're in a divorce, it feels like you're disagreeing about everything. And sometimes your children are the only thing you do agree about, right? Is that you want them to be safe and secure. But sometimes your co-parenting styles can be kind of what drives you apart in the marriage. After you have children, it's not uncommon for like 3 or 4 years after you have kids for the marriage to really fall apart. And I think that you touch on something in your book that we probably don't have time to get into in too much detail, but when you have a differing parenting style from your co-parent, there's the idea of parallel parenting and co-parenting. And how would you say those two concepts differ?
Well, first of all, I think of it as a continuum.
Yeah.
So parallel parenting at one end, where there's basically a firewall between the parents, each parent parents in their own way. If that's what it takes to reduce the conflict or
Like, this
eliminate
is
the
what happens
conflict
at mom's
between
house,
them.
this is what happens at dad's house. And yeah.
And if that's what it takes, that's not a bad option. Most people say they want to co-parent.
Right.
Co-parenting means there's a lot more communication, a lot more discussion, negotiating agreements. If there's a lot of conflict when parents are trying to co-parent, that's not the best way to parent. So what people need to find, and I think parents need to find, is the place on the continuum where they can tolerate talking to each other about parenting without escalating into conflict.
Right.
So the extremes are total co-parenting or total parallel parenting, but usually people are somewhere on that continuum in the middle.
Right. Okay, well, I think that pretty much wraps up our half hour together, and I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I want to say once again, you have a wonderful new book. People can buy it online. They can buy it on Amazon. It's called The Parent's Guide to Birdnesting. Subtitle is A Child-Centered Solution to Co-Parenting During Separation and Divorce. It not only will walk you through the entire process of birdnesting and what it looks like, but how to make a decision about whether or not to do it. It has an incredible amount of helpful worksheets in it, including the entire parenting plan for your divorce. You have a worksheet for like every decision that goes into that, the holidays, the weekends, the doctor's appointments, everything. It is a really, really helpful worksheet. So if you are somebody who is negotiating your parenting plan right now, or you're even just thinking about it, that section of the book alone would be very, very helpful to you. If you're curious about bird nesting for yourself or your clients, this book is a great, great primer, a total explanation of the process and all the various things that go into deciding whether or not to do it. The Good Doctor herself is available online. What is your website?
It's www.drannbuscho.com, and it's DRANNBUSCHO.com.
And do you work with clients virtually at all, like online?
Yes.
Or wonderful.
I am. But I work exclusively with people who are committed to not going to court.
Yes.
So I should say that, because
Yeah.
I do not want to go to court. I don't think it's healthy for families.
Yes.
I know it's necessary occasionally,
yes,
but it's not healthy for me.
Yes. And you are based in California, correct?
I am.
Do you work with people throughout the country?
I'll do consultations with people in other parts of the country.
Okay. Great.
I'm not doing long-term therapy.
Okay, great. And if you're a divorce professional and you're curious about learning more about Dr. Buscho's practice or just bird nesting in general, her book is a great resource, and I'm sure she herself would be happy to talk to you. So,
Absolutely.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much for sharing your time with our
Thank you
network
for
and our
having me.
clients. It is
Thank
a
you.
pleasure. I wish you were out there giving these book talks live all over the country. That's what you should be doing, but I'm glad we were able to give you a stop, and I hope you have many others.
Thanks so much. And
Okay.
good luck to you and your clients, and I hope things go well for all of them.
Thank you so much. All right. Have a good one.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.